The world is on a knife edge. There's over 100 armed conflicts currently taking place right across the globe. Some of these are new, others have been going on for decades. But each week we'll break down everything you need to know to understand the battles shaping the world today. Welcome to the War Zone. I'm Maddie Hale. This week we're looking at the conflict between North and South Korea. 70 years since the end of the Korean War, these two neighbouring countries are still locked in a bitter dispute that some experts believe could lead to another all-out war. What used to be one unified country, Korea was split into two after the Second World War in 1945, divided along the 38th parallel. North Korea came under the control of the Soviet Union, while South Korea was controlled and supported by the United States. These days, North Korea is under communist rule under Kim Jong Un's dictatorship, while South Korea is a democratic multi-party political system led by President Yoon Suk Yeol. While both countries wanted reunification, the possibility of that being done peacefully is unlikely to ever happen. Joining me now to break down the conflict between North and South Korea is political analyst on inter-Korean affairs, Robert Kelly. Robert, thanks so much for joining me today. In your words and understanding, how would you simplify the conflict between North and South Korea?
So it was originally an ideological and territorial conflict. I think between the communist and North and the capitalist democratic South. In time, I think the ideological aspect has sort of fallen away, and it's really increasingly a case of North Korean persistence, which is to say that North Korea really is sort of an antique state. It's a communist state for a world that really no longer exists. It's like the Asian version of East Germany, but unlike East Germany, North Korea continues to hang on, and that's primarily because the regime elite in North Korea fears unification, right? They would be hunted down by partisans, or they'd wind up in a South Korean jail or something like that. So it really isn't anymore about competing national visions or ideology or anything like that. I really think it's just pretty much regime survival for the dictatorship in the North, because quite honestly, they have so much blood on their hands. They fear any meaningful political change in the peninsula.
So do both Koreas still think that each of them should be running the whole peninsula?
Certainly the South Koreans do, right? That's the very first line of the South Korean constitution. Technically, North Korea does, although actually just recently, Kim Jong Un has said that unification is no longer on North Korea's agenda and that South Korea is a primary enemy. That's only in the last few months. But I would argue even before that North Korea had already lost the ability to meaningfully unify the Korean peninsula. North Korea's internal system is extraordinarily rigid. It doesn't function very well without external support. It was supported by the Soviet Union heavily during the Cold War. Today it's supported by China, right? I don't think North Korea, even if its elites wanted unification, could in fact absorb South Korea, because it would just be too difficult to pick up and integrate 50 million people accustomed to liberalism and democracy. So actually, I think that North Korea's goal really is, like I said before, just to kind of survive. It's a gangster state. It's run by sort of the Korean equivalent of the mafia. It's sort of like the Corleone family from the Godfather film. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I really think that's actually a proper analogy. And they fear change, right? They just want to sort of keep what they have, you know, the big mansions and the jet skis and the lifestyle and the rest of it, and the big screen TVs and stuff like that, the Rolls Royces. And that's really it. I mean, there's really nothing more complicated to it than that. It's like I said, it's gangster state. It's really not ideological anymore at all.
Well, at this stage, Robert, there hasn't really been any physical fighting between either side since the ceasefire was called at the end of the war in 1953, which killed millions of people. But there's obviously this mounting tension between the two countries and these threats, whether they be real or not. But how likely do you think it is that there will be an actual physical altercation?
So I think the most likely case for a conflict in Korea is some kind of accident spins out of control. I actually think neither Korea actually wants to risk a sustained military conflict with the other. If they wanted to do this, there were many, many opportunities in the last 70 years. That hasn't happened. I think the North Koreans really still wanted to invade South Korea. They would have done so. They've had nuclear weapons for almost 20 years now. They could have used them in the past to do this. There was some hint that North Korea would invade South Korea as late as the late 1970s, but since then there's nothing. And in South Korea, of course, it's a democracy, right? I mean, you're just not going to find public opinion supporting a rerun of the first war with, a million dead. So I actually think the status quo is fairly stable. The real problem is if they do get into a crisis, I think there's a lot of crisis instability because I think they're very powerful first mover advantages, which means that if they both think that war is going to happen, they're in a crisis, then it really is to the advantage of both of them to act first, right? And that creates a really powerful incentive to preempt, to sort of punch the other guy first, particularly for the North Koreans, because they're very vulnerable to Allied air power, to South Korean and American airstrikes. North Korea has a lot of nuclear weapons, but they're very vulnerable to strikes. So if you're North Korea and you think a war is coming, you need to launch your weapons first. And in my opinion, that's the big threat. That North Korea will use nuclear weapons preemptively because they fear losing them, because they fear a conflict is imminent.
You mentioned this before, but in January, Kim Jong Un said that there was no, possibility of reunifying in a peaceful way, and then he put South Korea as public enemy number one, stating that very publicly to the rest of the world. But then weeks later, he launched those cruise missiles in the Yellow Sea. What's the significance of launching these cruise missiles, but also exercising these military drills in this Yellow Sea area? And is it just to kind of show power?
Yeah, it's a sort of aggressive form of deterrence, right? So the North Koreans have a pretty substantial missile program, and they also have nuclear weapons now to put on those missiles. We don't know if they can put them on the cruise missiles. We know they can put them on the really big ones, the ballistic missiles. But the way the North Koreans, we think, the way we believe the North Koreans think about deterrence is that it's something that they have to prove all the time by behaving aggressively and belligerently. This is why we think the North Koreans engage in so many provocations, and we just saw the balloons flying over South Korea with the trash. That's very much the way the North Koreans think about yeah, I know it's ridiculous, but this is very much the way the North Koreans think about the contest, right? That the way to keep South Korea and the Americans at bay is to constantly sort of prod and poke and put their finger in the eye of the South Koreans. That's why these kinds of things come up again and again. And this is why I worry about crisis and stability, because one day if the North Koreans do something foolish and it goes too far and it provokes a reaction from South Korea, then you could get this kind of spinning out of control. And that, in my opinion, is where the real war threat is. Not that either side is like Hitler and going to march across the border. I think those days are past. I think the real issue is a crisis spinning out of control and leading to this preemptive cycle I was talking about before.
An accidental battle, if you will. Robert, getting back onto those balloons that you mentioned, because we'll keep this timely. Obviously, that happened last week or the week before. What did you make of North Korea sending those big balloons full of trash and feces and batteries over to South Korea? What kind of message are they sending there?
Yeah. I think it's really kind of a tit for tat game with the North. There are South Korean, anti-North Korean activists who release balloons from here in South Korea. They float across the demilitarized zone into North Korea, and they have like food and information, USB keys and stuff where you can sort of like watch South Korean movies and television and stuff like that. They bring what North Korea sees as subversive information into the North, and the North Koreans shoot down the balloons and stuff like that. And they've asked South Korean governments to stop permitting activists to release these balloons. This current South Korean government is comfortable with the activists releasing them, or at least doesn't repress them. And so there's been a wave of them in the last couple of years. And it looks like this is the North Korean response, a kind of tit for tat sort of game. I don't think there's any greater strategic relevance, but it does kind of indicate the way the North Koreans think about international relations, right? That it's just okay to drop trash on your neighbor, right? I mean, the North Koreans just don't, they just don't think about this stuff, right? I mean, they murder their own nationals overseas and stuff like that without really worrying about local laws. The North Koreans have engaged in meth trafficking, prostitution, human trafficking. I mean, they just don't follow the rules. And this is sort of like a silly example of that, but it is.
They're solely operating for themselves and by themselves, Robert. But let's get into a hypothetical war situation, whether this actually happens or whether it's likely or unlikely, who knows. But you said that North Korea would probably be the first one to strike. If this did happen and North Korea does strike, how would they do it, and how different do you think this fighting would be to the 1950s Korean War?
So if the North Koreans actually launch a territorial invasion, it will probably have to be quite similar because South Korea is very mountainous and there really aren't actually that many axes for the North Koreans to advance on. So it would actually look, if it was fought conventional, it would actually kind of look probably like it did last time. Except this time, of course, we're much better prepared and the Allies would be able to respond far better. This is why the North Koreans have built nuclear weapons, because the Allied conventional advantage today is simply massive. If you actually had a North Korean ground invasion, their best chance would be to break through into Seoul, the capital, which is pretty close to the North Korean border. Their best chance would be to break through into Seoul, cross the major river that bisects Seoul, which is called the Han River. And if they could actually do that, then they could break out into the middle of the country. That would be really difficult. The North Korean army is very large, but it is pretty out of date. It uses a lot of sort of Soviet era equipment. Sanctions on North Korea have also reduced significantly the amount of fuel the North Koreans have. There are a lot of questions about the quality of North Korean ammunition and stuff like that, right? So all these sort of issues about North Korean conventional preparedness most likely led to the North Koreans building nuclear weapons. Now, would they actually use a nuclear weapon in a conflict? In my opinion, yes, because without using a nuclear weapon, they would almost certainly lose, right? They might not lose immediately. Maybe they could break across the Han for a couple days or something like that. But Allied air power would decimate everything the North Koreans have above ground. We would just pound them and pound them and pound them. And eventually North Korean units would they'd lose command and control. They'd lose their ability to take orders, to talk to one another. They'd begin to fragment and probably surrender. That's my guess. And so because of that, the North Koreans really only have one chance, which would be to use nuclear weapons early to disrupt Allied communications, to disrupt Allied formations, and hope that they could sort of do like a blitzkrieg, a kind of lightning strike into South Korea and take the peninsula before the Americans arrived. But that's so risky that, again, I just don't think the North Koreans would do that.
If it were South Korea striking first.
Yeah, well, the South Koreans almost certainly aren't going to strike first. What would probably happen is, well, they might, if North Korea was collapsing, if there was like a coup and things spun out of control and everybody's like, oh my God, where are the nuclear weapons going and what's going on, and the places it's like turning into the Wild West, then it's possible that we might actually move in. In fact, possibly in coordination with the Chinese coming in from the north. I think an aggressive South Korean invasion of North Korea is extraordinarily unlikely. But if North Korea is falling apart, what you would have is probably, we think, you'd have a sprint between the South Koreans and the Americans in the South and the Chinese in the North to grab North Korea's nuclear assets before they disappeared. There's a big concern about this, right? That like if North Korea is spinning apart, if it's turning into like Afghanistan or Somalia or something like that, right? And the nuclear weapons are being spirited away and put on boats and sent off to be sold to some terrorist group, right? And so that's the fear. And so there's this. I've seen game scenarios that suggest that we and the Chinese, particularly the Americans and the Chinese particularly, would be dropping paratroopers around the peninsula to try to grab nuclear sites before some rogue colonel runs off with stuff like that. But the South Koreans would have to get into North Korea and stabilize the situation, occupy it, occupy the main cities, occupy the roads to basically keep the country from spinning apart. I mean, it's a really heavily armed country. There's enormous amounts of munitions, and now there's nuclear weapons too. So stabilization will be huge. So we'd have to get in there really fast.
So South Korea has the more advanced military portfolio over North Korea, but how reliant would South Korea be on those 28,000 US troops that are planted across South Korea, along with the military bases in South Korea, but in those surrounding areas and those islands?
Right. So I think the South Koreans are pretty good on the ground without our help.
Yeah.
The South Korean army has come a long way, and it's pretty substantial. Although South Korea's declining demography, South Korea's birth rate's really low. That raises manpower issues that are coming up in the next decade or two. I think it's really more in the air and on sea that the Americans really make a difference, particularly in the air, because that's really how the Americans fight, right? We bomb and then come in later on the ground. And the South Koreans just don't have the sheer number of planes. That they don't have the stocks that we do, and we would bring all of that to bear. We have a lot of assets in Japan, we have a lot of assets in Guam, and we would bring stuff in from the continental United States, and that would really be, I think, the major American contribution. I think it would be very unlikely the Americans would put a large army in here like we did back in 1950. The South Koreans are capable of the land conflict themselves.
How quickly would the US be able to get there and be able to occupy that air superiority over North Korea?
I think American air dominance, eventually air supremacy, would be established within a week.
Wow.
The primary issue is not the North Korean air power, like jets, right? Because the North Korean stuff is all pretty old. I mean, they might have a drone force. We're kind of learning about that. I think the real issue is surface-to-air missiles along the demilitarized zone and near Pyongyang. That stuff would need to be destroyed first, right? The suppression of enemy air defense. One of the very first things the Americans do, right? We strike the anti-air sites first, right? We bomb the sites that would attack our own planes, right? And once you do that, then you can send in the stuff that's more vulnerable, the bigger, heavier stuff, and that's what we use to then pummel the North Korean above ground formations. So again, I'm not an Air Force guy myself, but I have spoken with the U.S. Air Force in Korea, and the consensus seems to be within like a week or two.
How
10 days, maybe.
Well, before the Air Force got there, before the US troops arrived via air, how deadly would those first few days of fighting be on both sides of both Korean sides, do you think, for civilians?
Oh, yes, because the North Koreans would probably shell Seoul. Seoul is close enough to the North Korean border that it is within range of long-range North Korean artillery. There's actually a big debate out there about just whether or not, just how much the North Koreans could actually range Seoul. And they certainly threatened for many years to launch rockets and fire artillery at Seoul to decimate it, as that's sort of one of the arguments for not invading, right? If you invade us, we're going to kill all
Yeah.
these civilians. So they might do that. But I mean, and on the other hand, I mean, if the North Koreans are actually invading South Korea to take it intact, you don't want to blow up South Korean cities. So the whole point is to catch them intact. And I think this is really sort of the North Korean strategic dilemma, right? I mean, without using nuclear weapons, they probably can't win. But if you blow up South Korea with nuclear weapons, there's no point in taking it over, right? Because it's an irradiated disaster area, right? I mean, this is really the problem for the North Koreans, right? They can't win the way they want to, which is to actually take and absorb South Korea. They don't have the conventional capability, and they don't have the state capacity at home to actually absorb South Korea. They can destroy it, right? They can nuke it, but how much good does that do them, right? I mean, do you want an irradiated wasteland on your border? I mean, nobody wants that, right? So, I don't know. I think the North Koreans really don't actually have good attack options. I think it's highly unlikely they would attack because of this.
So, Robert, their upper hand, North Korea's upper hand in that situation would be that kind of first hit of Seoul.
That's right.
Because of obviously how populated it is. It's home to nearly 50% of the country's population. So by doing that first strike, whether it be missiles or they probably wouldn't go to nuke straight away, it would obviously kill a lot of people and send that message. But then the aftermath of that would just be obviously South Korea and the US taking over control and winning every battle after that.
I mean, that's right. I mean, there'd be pretty intensive conventional conflict on the demilitarized zone sector north of Seoul, right? I mean, that's basically where much of the war would be fought. There's a little bit on the East Coast, but not much. Mostly, you'd see it on the West Coast between the mountain range, the Yellow Sea. It's actually really not very much space. Really, it's only about 60, 70 miles deep, and that's where most of the fighting would be fought. If the North Koreans tried, they just launched a massive blitzkrieg of like 1 million men on the march. I mean, they might be able to punch through. But, that's the idea, right? The North Koreans would punch south towards Seoul. We would absorb that surge, right? Allied air power would come in and hit those North Korean spearheads, and then we would start to push them back. And all that's supposed to take place within a week or two. If the North Koreans are lucky, they can break through.
Yeah.
But that's doubtful without using nuclear weapons. But once you start using nuclear weapons, I mean, that's, then you raise the prospect of Americans nuking you in response, and got to fight through an irradiated nuclear wasteland. I mean, can the North Koreans fight in a nuclear environment? Probably not, right? So again, their options for winning this thing are so narrow, right? I think most of what I've seen on North Korea and sort of like explosion scenarios here is the North Korean regime collapsing, right? Not North Korea attacking South Korea and losing, and then what do we do? It's really there's a coup inside North Korea where the generals turn on each other, they execute the Kim family, and the place turns into Afghanistan, and then we all have to run in there because it's falling apart. That's why I worry. I think Korea observers worry more about that than, like a repeat of the Korean War, because again, it's so unbalanced against the North Koreans. Their options are really limited.
If the portfolios are so unbalanced, Robert, is North Korea more just sending empty threats?
Oh, no. I think that there was actually a conflict that the North Koreans would actually use nuclear weapons, because without them, they would lose it, right? I mean, we would just march right through, I think, a conventional conflict between the North and the South. No nuclear use at all. I think a straight conventional conflict would probably be over in 2 to 3 months at the most, probably more rapidly than that. And then the Kim family's on the run, right? So if you're the Kim family, right, and the Americans and the South Koreans are marching in your capital, your best chance is to push the button and say, if you don't stop, I'm going to keep launching nukes at you. So they would definitely go nuclear to prevent total regime defeat and total regime collapse, right? Which is why South Korea won't invade, because they don't want to get nuked.
Robert, sorry to interrupt, but if they didn't go nuclear, is there reason to believe that North Korea would use those, reported 5,000 tons of chemical weapons that they have in their possession on, say, hitting Seoul with that?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. There's a lot less thinking about what WMD, non-nuclear WMD scenarios are here, right? I mean, the problem with biological weapons is they're actually really difficult to maintain, right? The problem with chemical weapons is they're actually really difficult to control, right? What if the wind changes and stuff like that. I mean, there's actually not a lot of effective battlefield use of chemical weapons after World War I. I think the North Koreans would be pretty desperate and probably would use that. Although, like I said, I think they'd probably go to nuclear weapons first, just because the effects are better understood and more have a better sense of what they would do. But yeah, I think if the North Koreans, if the regime is falling apart, right, and we're moving in, and they know they're losing, right, the whole thing's going to be over in like a month or two. Their choices are either to like flee to China, and then who knows what happens to the Kim family if they go there, right, or to fight. Then yeah, I think they'll basically use anything they have, which is almost certainly why I think your question's a good one. It's almost certainly why they continue to keep biological and chemical. It's why they built nuclear, right? I mean, North Korea is really vulnerable, right? And so they got to use this. They basically have to use what they have to prevent defeat, and then the family's on the run, and they could be hanged or murdered like Mussolini. And
well,
right?
Robert,
I mean,
on the note of using what you have, if North Korea are busy sending millions of artillery shells to Russia in their fight against Ukraine, what does that say about North Korea's situation of if they're ready to fight? Because it's not like they're stockpiling their own military if they're happy to send millions since September to Russia.
Yeah, that's actually really excellent. That's a great question, actually. And I don't really think we have a good sense of what North Korean stockpiles are.
Yeah.
Presumably, if they're selling all this stuff to the Russians, they've got a lot extra, right? I mean, preparedness, right? But on the other hand, my own sense is the North Koreans probably don't actually think their conventional weapon systems work particularly well against us, the Americans and the South Koreans, because we're so far ahead, right? So it's not even clear that the North Koreans even need enormous amounts of artillery ammunition, because their entire strategy now rests on nuclear weapons, right? I mean, that's why they built them, because they're so far conventionally behind. So, why not sell them to the Russians rather than have them just sit in a locker or a warehouse somewhere rusting away, right? I mean, we know this, right? The North Korean munitions have had a high dud rate, high failure rate in Ukraine usage, right? So, I mean, they're basically just sitting there rusting. Why not sell them to the Russians? I mean, Putin's so desperate, he's probably giving them a good deal. But your question is a really good one. We just don't have a good sense of what North Korean stocks are, of how much they've actually given away of their total pile.
Well, just finally, Robert, to wrap this all up, a war happens tomorrow, North versus South Korea. Who's winning?
Oh, the South Koreans.
Yeah.
The North Koreans will, if the North Koreans surprise attack, they would win. They would have a pretty good week. And if South Korea could survive that week, which I believe they could, barring massive nuclear use, then yes, I think the South Koreans will win. Again, the only chance the North Koreans have is heavy nuclear use, but that's so risky, because then your Chinese ally walks away from you, then the Americans might nuke you in response. I mean, this is probably why the Russians haven't used nuclear weapons in Ukraine, right? I mean, they're very effective at the moment. They can do a lot of damage at the moment, but the after effects, right? The political isolation, right? I mean, the sanctions that will be forthcoming, right? The huge risks of other allies, other parties joining the war. I just don't think the North Koreans would do it unless, there was no other choice, unless the whole thing was falling apart.
Robert Kelly, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.